Circular Polarising Filter, the ND filter.
ND graduated filters. Hi everyone, it's finally here. This is it. This is my video all about filters for landscape photography. Okay, so thank you for joining me. I've been promising to do this video for a while now, and it's proven to be a real challenge. I had one go at it that I had to scrap because all of my audio didn't work, and then I've been finding it a real challenge to get the conditions that I need to properly demonstrate how each of the different types of filters work. Now, I don't use filters unless I need them, and that's meant that in order to demonstrate them properly, I've needed the right conditions. And I've ended up shooting this over several different days and several different locations in order to be able to do that. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the different types of filters that I use, what they're for, how I use them, and I'm going to be demonstrating the use of them in the field. This video is not about capturing any images, and I'm not sure that there's any images in here captured as part of the video that I'm doing that I bother sharing anywhere. The images that I'm capturing, where I have captured them, are really just to demonstrate what the filters are doing. I'll start off by saying I use a Lee filter system. I'm not endorsed, rewarded, sponsored, or have any other affiliation with Lee. Basically, I just happen to like their filters, but there are other filter makes out there. Some of them are a lot cheaper, but I don't think they're quite as good. But then it depends on whether you want to pay the money for them. The Lee filter system that I use uses square and rectangular filters, with the exception of one which screws on the front, which we'll come on to in a little while. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you three different types of filters. These three. We have the circular polarizing filter. We have the ND filter, and we have the ND graduated filter.
Okay, let's talk about this one, which is the circular polarizing filter. Now, there are all sorts of scientific explanations available on the web for how these work, but I'm not going to go into those. What I'm interested in is the practical application of the circular polarizing filter in landscape photography. The circular polarizing filter does two things. One of those things is very much dependent on the direction of the light, and it is also something that you can fairly easily replicate in post-production. The other thing that it does is less dependent on the direction of the light, and is something that you simply cannot replicate in post-production, and for that reason this is a filter that I think every landscape photographer should have in their kit bag. Now, my filter screws onto the front of my Lee filter holder, so I can use it with rectangular or square filters like ND Grads or ND filters, and then the whole thing fits on the front of the camera. Now, the first thing that a circular polarizing filter will do is boost contrast and saturation. Now, that is dependent on how much rotation, in other words how much polarization you dial into the filter, but it also very much depends on the direction of the sunlight, and it absolutely works at its best when the sun is at 90 degrees to the angle in which you're shooting. If you take your camera, point your finger along the lens in the direction that you're shooting, and then stick your thumb up to make an L shape, or imagine you're playing guns and this would be the hammer, I guess. If that's the direction you're shooting, the sun wants to be in the direction that your thumb is pointing. So if you rotate your hand that way and the sun is over there, the filter is going to be working at its best, or that way and the filter is going to be working at its best, or even straight up. The more you move away from 90 degrees, the less effect the polarizer will have on that saturation. But let's give you a quick demonstration. If we look at this scene where we've got clouds, white clouds against a blue sky, and I slowly rotate the filter, you will see the contrast between the clouds and the blue sky gets much, much stronger. Now you have to be careful. Overdoing that effect can look horrible, just as overdoing contrast and saturation in post-production can look horrible. Also, if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens and you've got a lot of blue sky, you do have to be careful because you can get uneven polarization. Because the filter works at its best at 90 degrees, if you've got a wide-angle lens, it's got a field of view of, I don't know, 100 plus 110 degrees. Off the top of my head, I don't know what my wide-angle lens does, but it's got to be somewhere around the 100-110 degree mark. Then one side of the image is going to be much closer to 90 degrees than the other side of the image. And what you tend to get then is a kind of a dark circle or a dark semicircle in the middle of the sky, which can be almost impossible to get out. So be very careful with circular polarizing filters and wide-angle lenses and blue skies. The second thing that the circular polarizer will do is it will cut out glare and reflection. So if you've got a surface which is reflective, such as water or water on something or something that's wet, it's quite likely that you will get glare and reflection coming off of that, and that can be a nightmare from an exposure point of view. Circular polarizer will cut that out, and what it will actually let you do is cut out the reflection to the point where you can actually see more of what's underneath the water than you would be able to without it. So in this scene, if I look at this, there are actually rocks underneath the water that are barely visible, but as I rotate the circular polarizing filter, you should be able to see that those rocks become much more clear, much more apparent as that polarizer takes effect. Now, removing glare and removing reflections and revealing what's beneath the water is something you cannot do in post-production. You can only do that with a circular polarizing filter. You don't have to have a big filter like this that fits on the front of a filter holder. You can get ones that screw directly on the front of the lens if that's what you prefer. Of course, removing reflections may not be what you want. If you're filming a scene which is all about the reflections, then you've got to be really careful about using a circular polarizer. You can kill your reflections. Also, if you've got a beautiful sky, like a sunrise or sunset sky with lots of colours, circular polarizer can kill it off really, really quickly. So, by all means, try it out, but make sure you check what the image looks like, both before and after a shot, to make sure that that circular polarizer is doing what you want and not taking away the very things that make a feature of your image. The ND filter. It has a single purpose. It blocks light coming into the front of the lens, makes the scene appear darker to the sensor, and therefore enables you to go for a longer exposure, which you might want to do if you want to blur a scene, blur moving water, blur clouds, even blur people. I have two ND filters. I have a 6-stop and a 10-stop. They are Lee filters. The 6-stop is the little stopper and the 10-stop is the big stopper. So both sets of filters have kind of a rubberized gasket that seals up against the filter holder and stops light from leaking in when you're doing a long exposure. It's worth mentioning that quite often these filters are not exactly the number of stops they're advertised to be. For example, my 10-stop filter is actually much closer to 11 stops, so I have to factor that in. Using one of these filters, it's important that it goes into the filter holder in the first slot closest to the lens, because that way the seal can stop the light from getting in. If light gets in between the filter and the lens, it will ruin the image. So when setting up a shot using an ND filter, there are some things to consider. The first thing is set up the composition first, add any other filters you might want to use, like circular polarizers or ND Grads, and get those into position and set first, and get your image in focus. All of those things will be difficult, if not impossible, to do once the ND filter is on the camera. Okay, so when shooting with an ND filter, because it's blocking light from coming in through the lens, your camera is probably going to struggle to evaluate the amount of light. Your camera's metering system probably won't be able to work out what the exposure should be. So you're going to be wanting to switch to manual and then setting your exposure manually based upon the type of filter that you've got on. It's then a case of seeing what exposure time you have without the ND filter, but with any other filters you want to use, and then calculating how much you need to change that exposure time for the filter that you're using. Now you can do that using some fairly simple maths. A lot of filters come with a little chart that you can use, or you can use an app on your phone. For example, the PhotoPills app has a calculation tool for different types of ND filters. Once you've got everything set up and your filter ready to go, you can then put the filter on the camera and get ready to take a shot. Once the filter is on, it's very important to make sure that the viewfinder is blocked if you're shooting with a DSLR. If you're shooting with a mirrorless camera that has a electronic viewfinder, you don't need to worry about that because there's no way that light can get in. But a DSLR, the viewfinder can leak light, and if that happens it will ruin the image because you'll get some sort of weird colour effects going on, which doesn't look very nice at all, and it's almost impossible to salvage afterwards. Now on my camera I have a little handy little switch that I can flick which brings a shutter across the eyepiece, but if you haven't got that you can buy little caps that go over the top to block it, or you can just stick something over the top. I've seen people use hats, socks, lens cloths, bits of sticky tape, all sorts of things. Doesn't matter so long as it stops light from getting into that viewfinder if you're shooting with a DSLR. The type of filter that you choose, a 6-stop, a 10-stop, whatever it might be, there's even 15-stop filters out there, will depend on the effect that you want to get. For example, on the scene that I'm going to shoot here, without a filter on, I have an exposure time of 1/60th of a second. Putting in a 6-stop ND filter will give me an exposure time of 1 second, but if I swap that out for a 10-stop filter, I can get an exposure time of 30 seconds, and they will produce very, very different effects, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so I've set my shot up, it's composed. I've got my focus set, I've got my exposure time calculated and dialed in, my filter is on, my eyepiece is closed off. I'm now going to take the shot. In fact, what I'm going to do is take 2 shots. The first one will be with a 6-stop filter, and that will be 1 second, and the second one will be with a 10-stop filter, and that will be 30 seconds, and you can just see what the difference is.
Okay, so just a couple of additional points on ND filters. The filters that I've shown here are square filters, the Lee filters, and they fit into slots in a filter holder, but you can actually get screw-on type ND filters that screw onto the lens, and I believe you can get some that are variable, so you can screw them on and then you rotate them as you would do a circular polarizing filter, but as you rotate them the density of them, in other words the number of stops so that they darken the scene, increases. I've never used them, so I can't comment on those. I've only ever used the square filters. The second thing to say is that most ND filters have a little bit of a color cast. The Lee filters, for example, leave a very slightly blue color cast, the 10-stop in particular. Others may leave a slightly magenta color cast. Some of the cheaper filters have a very strong color cast, and there are some that claim they have no color cast. Personally, I don't find the color cast a problem. It's very easily correctable using the white balance tool in something like Adobe Lightroom, and in fact in some cases I'll even leave some of that blue color cast in because it can actually add an interesting effect, and you can be a bit selective about how you correct it. It's also worth mentioning that using an ND filter to achieve a long exposure means you're going to blur things, and sometimes you might blur things that you don't want to. Depending on how you compose the image and what's included in the image, there are ways around that. And in fact, I did a video a while ago where I actually showed how I used a combination of a long exposure and a short exposure to avoid those unwanted blurry bits. So I'm going to put a link to that video up here now. and there'll also be one down in the description for this video. So with ND filters you can create very different effects, and those effects can be quite subtle, like this waterfall shot that I used a 6-stop ND filter to blur the water quite a bit but still leave some texture in there. Or like this shot where I used a 10-stop ND filter to achieve, I think, a 2.5 minute exposure, which with moving clouds has created a really quite dynamic effect. Not necessarily to everybody's taste, but the effect is there. ND graduated filters. It's this particular filter that's caused me the most problems in terms of making this video, because most of the time when I go out and I need to use an ND graduated filter, it's actually the most difficult time to shoot the video which demonstrates how that filter is used. So I'm doing a bit more of that kind of in the office with just a little bit out in the field. ND graduated filters, dark at one end, clear at the other. And what this means you can do is you can darken part of the scene and leave the rest of it untouched. Now, the way that graduated filters are identified is by how dark the dark bit is and by how quickly it turns from dark to clear. For example, this is a 2-stop hard-edged ND Grad. So the darkest part here blocks 2 stops of light coming into the lens, and it has a hard, or fairly hard at least, transition. So it goes dark, 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 little tiny bit which is sort of going between dark and clear, and then it's clear. This is a 2-stop soft-edged ND Grad. So it's 2 stops at the top, it's clear at the bottom, but it has a very, very gradual transition between dark and clear. This one is much more useful when you haven't got a straight line horizon, when you've got some things that are sticking up into the sky or into the brighter part of the image. Whereas the hard edge works really well when you have a straight line horizon with nothing much sticking up into it. As a point of interest, if you use a hard-edged ND Grad with a telephoto lens, it will work like a soft-edged ND Grad because of the magnifying effect, because it's actually looking through much less of the filter. So now let's go and take those ND filters out into the field and I'll show you how I use them. I have now been out 5 times trying to get that segment on using the ND Grads out in the field. 3 sunrises, 2 sunsets, in locations where I quite often use ND Grads, but just because of the weather conditions that we've been having, I haven't needed to use them, and if I don't need to use them, I can't demonstrate them properly. Now, this video has been delayed so many times, I just want to get it out there so that people can see it. So I've gone back to my archives and I've got some footage when I was using an ND Grad, and I think I can use this to demonstrate the use pretty effectively. And then what I'll do in some future videos, I'll talk a bit more about filters, not just ND Grads but all types of filters, and using them in combinations to get different effects. So as I look at this scene on the back of the camera, the important thing to do is to look at the histogram. And you can clearly see here that the histogram has got blown highlights. And in fact, if you look at the preview screen, this area here looks as if it's blown out, and it actually is. You can't always rely on what that preview looks like, which is why I'm always checking the histogram. But even on this preview, you can see this is going to be a problem. If I look at the other end of the histogram, I can see the shadows are just touching. Now what that means is if I bring the exposure back to reduce the blown highlights, I'm going to start clipping shadows. Now if it was just a little tiny bit, then I'd probably just do it. But looking at the way that histogram is stacked over on the right hand side, there's a good couple of stops there. So that's going to mean I'm going to end up underexposing by at least 2 stops. And whilst I can recover a lot of detail in the shadows, I don't really want to be recovering that much. If you're wondering how I'm calculating that there's a good 2 stops there, it's basically just because I know the histogram on my camera pretty well, and I can reasonably easily calculate how many stops I need to pull that back. But if you're not sure, then the easiest way to do it is actually bring the exposure back and see how many stops you have to reduce it until those highlights are no longer blown. So given the challenges that I've got here, I've got 2 options. I could take 2 or more exposures at different levels, so one for the highlights, one for the shadows, and maybe one in the middle, and then merge them later in Lightroom or Photoshop or some other tool. Or I can use an ND Grad. And this scene with a nice level horizon is an ideal opportunity to use the ND Grad. So as I slide the ND Grad into the holder, and this is a 3-stop ND Grad, you can see the way the histogram just comes down. So let's look at that again a little bit more slowly. And I apologise for my shoulder getting in the way just a little bit there, but you can see the histogram is coming down. So looking at this in a bit more detail, we've got no more blown highlights, so that's good. The shadows are still just touching, and that means I've got a nicely balanced histogram. And looking at the preview, you can now see that there is detail in the sky, which was completely missing before. But again, you can't rely on that preview. The histogram is the important thing to look at. So that's it. That's my video about filters. It's taken a while to do, and I know some of you have been patiently waiting for it, and I appreciate your patience. Sorry it's taken so long. I hope it's been interesting and informative. If you've enjoyed this and maybe you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, maybe you'd like to consider doing that now, then you won't miss out on any of my other videos, whether it's this kind of tutorial type or whether it's the just going out and exploring type. Likes and shares are really helpful, so if you want to hit like or share, that'd be much appreciated. And of course, comments. I'd love to hear from you. Comments go down below. I always respond, and I try to do so as quickly as possible. Finally, I appreciate you taking the time to watch, and I'd like to say thank you very much. And until the next video, bye.